Good afternoon. Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG, and we've got an exciting show for you today. It's the turn left takeover of Novara Media. I'm joined by their founder and my own close personal friend, Curtis Daly. Curtis, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, do you know what? I'm really excited. I'd say my first debut show on Novara Media is couldn't be better with yourself, Helena. So very happy to be here. And yes, of course, it is the turn left takeover. Watch your backs, Novara. Just kidding.
It's an absolute pleasure to be joining you in your first foray into Novara Media tonight, Curtis. Good to have you. Coming up on tonight's show, what life is like for doctors in Gaza, Rachel Reeves' £1.5 billion promise to the North, the thing that everyone gets wrong about Reform UK, and Piers Morgan's heated exchange with Natasha Hausdorff. Stay tuned for all of that. Or if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Former Labour Party leader and now independent MP Jeremy Corbyn has tabled a bill in Parliament calling for a Chilcot-style public inquiry into Britain's role in Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. This was Corbyn speaking to reporters ahead of Parliament today.
I'm here outside Parliament, part of, not a thin red line, a very substantial, very thick red line of people supporting the Palestinian people of Gaza and the West Bank and those in the refugee camps. And this afternoon I'm introducing a private member's bill demanding an independent public inquiry into British policy, into the supply of arms, into the complicity with acts of genocide, into the use of the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri, into the sharing of security information, and demanding that we are told the truth. Britain stops supplying arms and makes sure the Palestinian people get the support, the recognition, and immediately the food, the medicine, the water, the electricity they so desperately need.
Corbyn presented the bill this afternoon under Parliament's 10-minute rule. That's a rule that allows backbenchers to introduce potential legislation. While these bills rarely become law, they allow backbenchers to raise issues in the Commons, potentially triggering a debate and also potentially a vote. Presenting the bill, Corbyn laid out two grounds for the inquiry. This was the first one.
Britain has played a highly influential role in Israel's military operations. First, Britain has been supplying weapons to Israel, weapons that are being used to bomb the people of Palestine. This, of course, started with the previous Conservative government, but is continued with the current Labour government. In fact, between October and December 2024 alone, more arms export licences were granted than were approved by the previous government for the whole of 2020 and 2023. In September 23, the government suspended some licences but continued to allow the supply of F-35 components to the global pool. The Foreign Secretary has accepted the fact that F-35 jets are being used in violation of international humanitarian law, yet at the same time admits those parts go into the global supply chain and could therefore go to Israel. They know full well the implications. By justifying the continued licensing of these parts, our government is admitting its complicity in what are quite clearly war crimes. I find this truly astounding. The government is telling us loud and clear that its participation in this programme is more important than upholding international law and the Convention on Genocide. It's very simple. Until this government ends the sale of weapons to Israel, it will remain complicit in the mass murder of Palestinians in Gaza at the present time.
And yeah, you have to agree with him, everything he's saying there. Once you are selling weapons to people who are committing crimes against humanity and war crimes, you do become complicit. And of course, as has been pointed out, this doesn't just apply to our current government, although they have been ones who have kept arms licenses outside of an 8% that they cancelled those licenses last September. The previous government were also selling weapons and did not remove any of those licenses. So 100% that is absolutely pertinent information that we do need to know. And this was Corbyn's second grounds for an inquiry.
Secondly, many of us have repeatedly been asking for the truth regarding the role of British military bases in Cyprus. Since October 23, military cargo has been airlifted from RAF Akrotiri to Israel. This cargo has often travelled to Cyprus from US military bases in other parts of Europe. Meanwhile, RAF shadow aircraft have also been conducting nightly surveillance flights over Gaza. And when the Prime Minister visited RAF Akrotiri last December, he was telling troops the whole world and everyone back at home is relying on you. Quite a bit of what goes on here can't necessarily be talked about all of the time. We can't necessarily tell the world what you're doing. In a recent report by the British Palestine Committee, it says the UK government is engaged in military actions without being subject to parliamentary scrutiny, and that these actions implicate its institutions and officials in the gravest breaches of international law.
We even had a Labour MP at a pro-Israel conference bragging, essentially, about what we were seeing in terms of the RAF engaging in flights over RAF Akrotiri. The public deserve to know. The public deserve to know what these flights are being used for, what the purpose is, and of course, what has been allowed to be shipped from Akrotiri to Israel, and if indeed these are ones which are being done at the behest of the United States. We absolutely have a right to understand what is going on here. This can't be kept secret from the public, especially when they are openly talking about the fact that something is going on that we don't know about, especially when it has the purview to making us complicit in violations of international law. This must come to light as far as I am concerned. The bill is supported by 19 MPs. They include Corbyn's fellow members of the Independent Alliance, Shaukat Adam, Adnan Hussain, Ayub Khan and Iqbal Mohammed, as well as independent MPs Zahra Sultana and Absana Begum. 9 Labour MPs are behind it too, including Richard Bergen, Nadia Whittome and Bel Ribeiro Addy. Green MP Ellie Chowns has backed it too, as well as MPs from Plaid Cymru and the SNP. The bill was passed without dissent, meaning it will go to a second reading and potentially a debate. If that happens, it could put a lot of Labour MPs loyal to the government in a tricky position. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has favoured describing Israel's attacks on Palestinians as horrific, unacceptable and utterly intolerable, whilst doing almost nothing to pressure the country into ending its genocide. And speaking in Parliament, Middle East Minister Hamish Faulkner made clear of what he thought of Corbyn's bill.
Would he welcome an independent inquiry into the British government's policies in relation to F-35 jet parts, for example? Because this seems to be becoming more and more mysterious. Yeah. Apparently they're sold into the global supply chain, but we have no control over what happens to them. They might end up in the hands of Israel, or they might not. Is he seriously expecting the House to believe that the manufacturers of these components do not trace them, do not track them, do not label them, do not identify them? I think the government knows exactly where those parts are going and exactly that they are enabling those F-35 jets to bomb Gaza and take part in acts of genocide. Does he not deserve an independent inquiry?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have talked about these issues many times. They are in the High Court being discussed in a judicial review. At the moment, I do not see that this could be any further scrutinised and litigated, or what an independent inquiry on the position of the F-35 parts would achieve.
Public opinion, however, swings sharply against the government's softly approach with Israel. 7 out of 10 Britons now think that Israel should stop its military action in Gaza and call a ceasefire. Just 3 out of 10 think it should continue. Plenty of those seem to be in the Parliamentary Labour Party, who are strongly at odds with the mood of the nation, and Corbyn's bill comes on the back of a new intervention by some of Britain's most well-known public figures. Dua Lipa, Gary Lineker and Benedict Cumberbatch have joined other figures from the arts and media, as well as doctors, lawyers and a Holocaust survivor, to urge Starmer to end the UK's complicity in Israel's genocide in Gaza. Curtis, this intervention from Jeremy Corbyn and the potential for an independent inquiry, do you think this is something that's coming to pass? Will it be pivotal? Is it just another loud voice in the chorus of loud voices calling for more scrutiny and to hold this government to account?
No, I don't think it's just a loud voice. I think this is actually a really important intervention here. I think it's also very smart from Jeremy Corbyn. And obviously, when you listen to Jeremy Corbyn, you can hear how passionate he is. And it really means a lot to him. Of course it does. I think in terms of whether this bill is going to get passed, it's quite a tall order. It's doubtful it's going to happen. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn expects that. But I don't think that's the point. The point is to get this into the public consciousness. If we look at the Iraq War, for example, I think it's important to bring that up because actually Chilcot, his name is invoked in that, which again I think is very smart. There was a lot of historical revisionism going on. Many people saying, "Oh, I was against the Iraq War. I was always against it," and they weren't. I think what this does is it shows and it signals to the people that majority of people are against this. Obviously, you've seen the polls with the British support for Israel is very low. And I think Jeremy Corbyn and MPs who are supporting him know the public are not on side of this, and they would support some kind of investigation. I think what's incredibly smart is when we look in the future and this bill, gets to Parliament, we will see who voted for it and against it. So just as I was saying about Iraq war revisionism, there are going to be people, we know it, who are going to say, we never supported Israel in their efforts. We never supported this genocide. Of course we didn't. Well, we have that. We have the receipts. And Jeremy Corbyn is doing exactly that. But I think, and it's also similar to what Jeremy Corbyn did a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, him and the Independent Alliance, they created a booklet. And this booklet was for the media. There were questions to, hold Keir Starmer and the Labour government to account. These questions were about arms sales. These questions about facilitating the genocide, F-35 parts, etc. And it was really clever because, one, I think it shows the wider public these are the sorts of questions that Keir Starmer should be held to account on. But two, if you're a journalist who has the opportunity to speak to Keir Starmer, you're a lobby journalist, you probably aren't going to be asking those questions. Therefore, people would look at this booklet and go, actually, the media aren't asking these questions too. So I think it's pressure from Corbyn. It's going to move the dial maybe an inch, maybe more. But I think it's more than just making noise from the places you expect it to be from. It's also significant that there's a handful of MPs, Labour MPs, who are backing this. So I think this is very smart from Jeremy Corbyn. I hope, obviously, we would like for this investigation to happen. It's very unlikely the Labour government are going to investigate themselves, which is why I don't think it's going to happen. But of course, in terms of the consciousness of the public, this is going to help shift the dial.
It reminds me of when there was the vote on the ceasefire on the SNP Opposition Day motion, that Labour were desperate not to happen by tabling their own amendment, which was not getting carried, for example. And specifically because they don't want their names to be next to the record of having been against the, at the time, ceasefire vote. And obviously now we want to make sure that we know who is and who isn't in favour of an independent inquiry. Otherwise, what must they have to hide? A week today, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, is due to announce her spending review, which will set out departmental spending allocations for the next few years. Given the perilous state of the public finances and the ever-increasing demands from her cabinet ministers for extra cash, this has been eagerly anticipated. Rachel Reeves laid out one of her key plans in a speech earlier today in Greater Manchester.
But today I want to tell you about just one part of our plan: renewing our transport systems in England's largest mayoral regions, including here in Greater Manchester and across the North and the Midlands. Because connectivity is an absolutely critical factor in unlocking the potential of towns and cities outside of London. One of the areas in which previous governments have promised most, but delivered least. And that will now change. Let me tell you why it matters. Modern growth rests on dynamic, connected city regions, creating clusters of activity so that people can get around, communicate, share ideas, commute, find good work, and earn wages that flow back into strong local economies. Stronger transport links within cities and the towns around them create opportunity by connecting labour markets and making it easier for firms to buy and sell goods and services in different places to different people. Labour's strong investment in the past in strongly integrated transport systems, including in London, helps explain London's global success and also its advantages over other UK cities. Now, we want London to succeed, but it is the lack of that infrastructure which puts England's other great cities, Birmingham, Liverpool, Newcastle, at a disadvantage compared to their European counterparts that have this infrastructure. And it helps to explain our underperformance relative to other European economies. If we were to increase the productivity of those second cities in the UK to match the national average, our economy today would be £86 billion larger. And so because this government believes that prosperity must come from the contribution of us all, because all of the sizable evidence shows that public investment can crowd in many times its volume in private investments, and because we know the potential that exists in all of our towns and cities, I can tell you today that we will be making the biggest ever investment by a British government in transport links within our city regions and their surrounding towns. £15.6 billion in transport funding settlements to be delivered by our regional mayors, more than doubling real-term spending on city-region connectivity.
Well, this is all true, by the way. The lack of transport infrastructure, the lack of the ability to have a more dynamic economy in areas such as the North, which have been completely deprived of investment for decades after decade, is a good thing. It must be called a good thing. And it's interesting when you compare this to what she was talking about in the budget last year, talking about having a Silicon Valley between Oxford and Cambridge. I might get your voters aren't there, Rachel, right? Like your voters that you're going to be losing are in the North, in the Labour heartland constituencies, especially in places like the North East, places like Newcastle. Look at where County Durham went in the last local elections. So investment in these areas is key. And the fact that it's taken them this long to have this as being some kind of flagship policy speaks that they really have taken their eye off the ball, but I guess better late than never. Now, as you pointed out there, some of the key benefactors of this investment will be Labour's regional mayors. Andy Burnham has been pioneering his integrated locally owned bee network for some years now, and this extra funding will be welcomed. Early today, he posted this on Twitter. Big news for the bee network. The government is backing it with a £2.5 billion to become the UK's first fully integrated all-electric public transport system by 2030. It will help deliver 8 rail lines and 64 stations into the CAP system by 2028, a new tram line to Stockport, a new tram train service connecting Bury, Hayward, Rochdale and Oldham, new interchanges for Lee and Bury, and a new tram stop for North Manchester. Now, for those who live in London, an integrated transport system has been commonplace for decades. However, outside of the capital, the North has had to deal with the car crash of privatisation. Bringing the hugely successful TfL model to the country's second largest population centre is long overdue. Since the bee network was introduced, ridership has gone up, a record 58 million journeys in the past year, and the move to full electric will further help Greater Manchester cut emissions as part of their climate transition, with bus fares capped at £2 in defiance of the 50% increase announced by Westminster last year. Public ownership works, people. One of the other big expectations from the spending review is setting out how Labour will plan to U-turn on the winter fuel allowance means test. This is seen as the government's original sin and is often cited by voters as their main reason for abandoning Labour in focus groups. In her speech, Rachel Reeves confirmed they'll be expanding eligibility. However, Pensions Minister Torsten Bell MP confirmed that it will not be made universal again.
The cost of living crisis is still with people. Energy bills are a large part of that, even though there is some good news coming in July in terms of a falling energy price cap, but they're still much higher than lots of us would like to see them being. So he's been clear we'd like to see more people eligible for the winter fuel payment. Directly on your question on is there any prospect of a universal winter fuel payment, the answer is no. The principle, I think most people, 95% of people agree that it's not a good idea that we have a system paying a few £100s to millionaires, and so we're not going to be continuing with that, but we will be looking at making more pensioners eligible.
I find it very frustrating that we still have this means testing debate and they're still holding firm on not making it universal, when of course having a means test means that there will be people who fall above the threshold, there are people who fall through the cracks when you administer that means test, if you administer it incorrectly. And in reality, although this is an emotional argument as to, well, wouldn't you feel bad if someone who didn't deserve the thing got the thing, rather than how do we maximise utility with a policy? When, of course, the FT was reporting recently that they were considering making it universal and having a tax taper so that you just tax it back off the richer pensioners to ensure that they're not getting money they don't need, which ensures that no matter where you are on the income spectrum, you at least get some remuneration from the universal benefit, which in my mind would be a much better policy change than keeping the means test. Matt Bruenig's got a great blog about this at his think tank, the People's Policy Project, about why means testing is more expensive than universal benefits. I highly recommend checking that out. Given all this talk of tough choices and competing demands for public sector expenditure, however, Rachel Reeves felt the need to clarify in her speech today that she will not be flexible with her fiscal rules.
Over the next week, you will hear a lot of debate about my so-called self-imposed fiscal rules. Now, contrary to some conventional wisdom, I didn't come into politics because I care passionately about fiscal rules. I came into politics because I want to make a difference to the lives of working people. Because I believe as strongly now as I did when I was inspired to join the Labour Party almost 30 years ago, that every person should have the same opportunities as others to thrive and to succeed, no matter what their parents do, no matter where they grow up. and because I know that economic responsibility and social justice go hand in hand. Now, after 2022, no one should need to be told about the dangers of reckless borrowing for the financial security of ordinary families. When Liz Truss and the Conservatives trashed market confidence in our British economy, it was working people who paid the price. Be in no doubt, Nigel Farage and Reform are itching to repeat that exact same experiment, to pursue those fantasy economics all over again. And the results? Well, they would be the same. Market instability and interest rates rising, with soaring rents and thousands of pounds extra on families' mortgages. Businesses would pay more for their borrowing, and pensions that people save hard for would be put in peril again. I will never take those risks. Labour will never take those risks. Strong and transparent fiscal rules are an indispensable safeguard for working people, and that is why my rules are non-negotiable. So let's be clear. It is not me imposing borrowing limits on government. Those limits are the product of economic reality.
I find it very frustrating every single time this gets brought up, that she continues to go with the line that somehow borrowing to invest is the same as the car crash tax cuts that you got from Liz Truss and potentially that you would get from Nigel Farage and Reform UK. If you cut taxes for the wealthy, you can't guarantee that gets invested to increase the productive capacity of the economy. Most likely gets squirreled off to a bank in the Cayman Islands, right? Like the bond vigilantes, they're not ideological. They are they are automatons who respond to incentives, who respond to the belief in whether or not the government can pay down the debt, right? And if you can build a growing economy through investment, there's no reason why you should be able to expand further than what the quote-unquote fiscal rules would allow by having a certain time with which debt to GDP has to drop by, right? I absolutely resent this idea that we need to impose some level of restraint in terms of borrowing to invest at a time of critical low investment. As Reeves pointed out earlier on in her speech, so much so that we have to place arbitrary limits on where that must be, and then also use the complete opposite, i.e. tax cuts and not borrowing to invest, as somehow a cautionary tale of what happens when you borrow money. I find that link between what is being proposed by left-wingers, like the opposition in the Green Party, for example, and what's being proposed by Nigel Farage and Reform UK as somehow being the same when they absolutely are not. Now, that's not to say, however, that the government can spend with total impunity. The constraints of real resources and inflation do matter. Taxation is a necessary part of the levers at the government's hands with which to control inflation and to ensure the stability of the balance of payments and the value of the pound. And one thing that's been missing from discussions around tax and spend in this country has been the economic reality that this country currently lives in. Much has been said about the UK having the highest tax burden since World War II. However, this is never contextualised by the fact this is happening across countries in the global north, with ageing populations, increasing reliance on social security, and the ever-expanding demand for healthcare has seen taxes rise across Europe in the last half a century. No political party in this country is being truthful with the public about the choices on offer. The Tories and Reform still banging the drum that we can just cut our way to growth and slash the public realm even further to fund fantasy tax cuts. And the Labour Party is disingenuously attacking the Tories for overseeing the increase in taxation that was necessary to keep the country afloat, only to raise taxes even further last autumn. At least the Green Party are honest about the necessity of expanding the spending envelope, both on operational and on capital expenditure, and also proposed a wealth tax and increases in national insurance and capital gains tax to fund those increases in spending. What I worry is that whilst, of course, the need to make the rich pay more is a pressing one for a whole host of reasons, it's paramount, we must tax the rich, we are creating a discourse which assumes that tax is something someone else should pay. So much has been said of the decay of the social contract post-Thatcher, and the desire for US levels of taxation and Scandinavian levels of public service is a total pipe dream. We must be clear with the public that we all must pay in for us to reap the benefits. and have the public services that we want. We cannot just rely on just the rich to contribute. Of course, they should be the prime contributors. But if we want a new social contract, one which stops the doom loop of poor public investment, making the public to cry, paying taxes to a state that doesn't work, which only compounds underinvestment as people warrant more tax cuts with those failing public services, we should be making the argument as to why everyone should want to pay into a better system for everyone. Now, that's not to say that taxation is our only option. Whilst redistribution is important, especially at a time of growing wealth inequality, so is pre-distribution, i.e. ensuring that you have a system that is set up equally in the first place, rather than equalising an unequal society through redistribution. If we really want an economy where people have a stake in society, where they feel personally compelled to contribute, rather than resent being forced to, we must argue to give them that stake. This means more social ownership, more cooperatives, more assets held in common. This fundamental shift of property rights from the few to the many is the key to solving the problem of alienation in the modern era, a problem from which, in my mind, many other social issues stem. Curtis, what do you think? Should we all be paying more tax?
So I understand the argument there, actually. There's a lot I would love to comment on. I think, first of all, for me, we need to tax the rich rather than looking at sort of tax rises more broadly. I mean, we can have a discussion about that because obviously in terms of like the participation in society, I understand that. But right now, we need to be taxing the rich. Now, Gary Stevenson has made this very popular. Of course, it's been a popular policy anyway. But the fundamental reason to increase taxes on the rich isn't the politics of envy, as people say, or even about fairness, even though politicians say that a lot, and it is about fairness. But the real thing is the fact that we are in such a grossly unequal society. The difference between a million and a billion is hard to contextualize in just words. In fact, people don't really understand the differences until you literally make, you physically show someone somehow. But basically, I mean, I like to use this example of Netflix. People might be asking, why are you bringing up Netflix in terms of the wider economy? But I think it's a really good way of showing the how the economy is going to look or how it's becoming. Netflix started off as a pretty cheap subscription service. It was £5 a month, I think it was. And this was in a time when everyone was using, or a lot of people were using Pirate Bay and sort of torrent websites. And then Netflix came in and said, look, you could do this legally. It's only £5 a month. And a lot of people jumped ship. But what's happening now? Netflix is increasing their prices. They're creating tiers. They're even taking things off, like films and TV. And people are realizing we're not owning anything anymore. Think about games. They're all on the cloud. You're downloading them because they're not physical anymore. And people are worried about that. Then you look at housing. Home ownership is going down. So what does that mean in the broader context of the economy? It means when you have multi-millionaires and corporations buying up everything, they end up renting it back to us. It was actually very funny because people like to say, well, communism is about, your own nothing. It's what's happening under this form of rentier capitalism. So we have to tax the rich. And I'm talking about proper wealth taxes. We could look at income taxes. I mean, let's look at the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, marginal tax rate was at 90%. Of course, that's marginal. It's not 90% of your wage. It's 90% of the tax bracket. But even under Margaret Thatcher, it was at 70%. Now it's 45%. But really, it's the wealth that needs to be taxed. Now, I'm obviously encouraged to see the Green Party and other people call for a 1% tax. I think that's a starting point. It doesn't really dent the levels of inequality because, again, it's not really about the politics of envy. It's about saying, look, if you're successful and you have a great life, fantastic. But if we have billionaires, this is a real problem because we can't have a thriving economy, even an entrepreneurial economy. We can't have that because of the gross levels of inequality. So your question about, obviously, do we have to have tax rises on everyday people? I think that'll be very difficult to do in this certain sort of political landscape. People feel like they're being ripped off. And I think they broadly are. They're paying taxes and they have broken public services. We have PFI and privatization, all of that wealth has been sucked out of the public realm into private hands. And people feel like, why am I paying taxes for? There is an argument to be made. And I think Bernie Sanders actually made this argument in the US when he talked about Medicare for all. It's a really good argument. People were attacking Bernie Sanders by saying, you want free healthcare? Well, taxes are going to have to go up. And he said, yes, taxes will go up. But there's a difference. Would you rather pay public or private taxes? And what did he mean by that? We said public taxes is, I'll increase your taxes by a couple of percent and you'll get free healthcare at the point of use. Private taxes are your insurance premiums, are when you hurt yourself. And even if you have insurance, there's extra costs on top of that. That's a private tax. And often you pay more. So I think there is a debate to be had about maybe everyday people could pay a little bit more in taxes. Whether that's a good sell for the public right now is probably not going to wash, especially when it comes to reform. I mean, their retail offer at the last election was increasing the tax threshold to 20%. And I actually wonder why the Green Party aren't offering that. Now, I've spoken to many people who voted reform. They wouldn't consider themselves right-wing. In some cases, they would say they're left-wing. And someone said, look, I looked through the manifestos. I meticulously looked at the policies. And fair play, they read the policies, they read the manifestos. And they said, I'm thinking I'm going to vote reform because the tax threshold. That's a retail policy that does offer something. Now, of course, we don't trust reform's broader economic policy. Why would you reduce taxes when we have, so much public spending? But I do think this is probably something that, in terms of the public consciousness, asking for tax rises on ordinary people might be a very difficult sell. But I think it's possible. I think you can do it if you were to offer some really redistributive policies like you talked about. I hate to go on, but a few years ago, I know it's anecdotal, but I had a conversation with an older gentleman in a pub, one of the typical old man pubs. We love those. And when it came to his views on culture and social issues, they weren't very good, I have to say. When he talked about the economy, he said, do you know what? I pay 50% in income taxes if it meant I could have free healthcare, free food, free transport, free internet, free housing. And of course, I'm not saying that we should suggest as the left to boost income taxes to 50%, but it does say that I think there is a trade-off people would be willing to have if we had huge amounts of investment. But this is the kind of investment you would never see from this Labour government.
Yeah, and I think that my response, I guess, would be when you look at the policy of increasing the tax-free threshold from reform, is that what people don't understand really is that this is a tax cut for everyone apart from the big earners who don't get the tax-free allowance anymore. And therefore, you have to reduce the level of service provision in the economy across the whole board, right? So even people who don't use public services are going to see a reduction in service level provision that they don't use. Whereas the predominant group who use those public services are the people who are giving a tax cut to. So it's essentially a wash for them. They're still getting the same returns because they're paying less tax but getting less service provision. So that's worse for the people at the bottom, even though it sounds like a lot, right? And of course, the reform retail offer is to give a small tax cut to the poor and a big tax cut to the rich. And as Gary Stevenson said on Downstream, which you can watch on this channel in the playlist, which is labelled there for you to see in the tab, would explain it. That if you give a poor person £10 and if you give a rich person £1,000, the poor person's gotten poorer in relative terms because money is about real resources and their distribution, right? It's making it clear to people that a strong public realm, higher taxes, this is better for the poorest because it means that they have more coming back from the state because it's for everybody. And because they're contributing less, they're the ones who are making the best benefit out of that. But that's a semantic argument that is difficult to pass, which is much easier to be able to sell if you're saying, I'm just going to cut your taxes, you'll have more money in your pocket. I think that's where the bridge has to be found on these issues. Now, there is one kind of tax you definitely should be paying. I want to take a moment to thank you all who have signed up to be backing our work and become monthly supporters. We're incredibly proud of what we've been able to build here at Novara and the type of analysis that we can provide. But none of what we do here would be possible without our supporters. Your support allows us to be editorially independent. It means we will never be funded by billionaires or venture capital, unlike most of the mainstream media. We're currently doing a huge call out for 1,000 of you to sign up and join our incredible community of supporters who make all of this possible. So if you value our work, consider supporting us by heading to novaramedia.com/support. Israel has been allowing a trickle of aid into the Gaza Strip since last week. That's after an almost 3-month complete blockade on the Strip. But to get that aid, Palestinians in Gaza had to travel to only 1 of 2 or 3 distribution points for aid, operated by the Gaza Health Foundation. That's a shady organization linked to a former CIA operative and staffed by US mercenaries. On the second day of that operation, Israeli soldiers opened fire on the crowds of Palestinians as the foundation lost control of its distribution center, reportedly killing 10 Palestinians and injuring 62. On Sunday morning, 30 Palestinians were reported killed by the Israeli military whilst waiting for food, while a further 170 were injured. Then, on Wednesday, a further 27 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli gunfire near an aid site, with over 160 reported injured, resulting in the United Nations demanding an investigation. And now, in response to the Israeli military shooting Palestinians at the centers, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has shut up shop. The organisation is suspending operations after Israel declared access routes to the distribution points combat zones, with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation demanding better civilian protection at the centres. And who are they asking to provide that civilian protection? Israeli soldiers, of course. In a statement, the GHF said they've asked the Israeli military to, quote, guide foot traffic in a way that minimises confusion or escalation risks. And they add that, quote, our top priority remains ensuring the safety and dignity of civilians receiving the aid. If that's their top priority, then perhaps they should heed the calls of every major humanitarian agency in the world who've criticised the GHF for putting aid distribution in Gaza under Israel's control. Amongst them is British charity Action for Humanity, who said this. Today, this system, the GHF, has shuttered, depriving thousands of aid access, while Israeli forces escalate military operations in civilian areas and declare aid distribution points as combat zones. An entire population has been denied, humiliated and traumatised by this negligent and insufficient system. Beyond the countless casualties since the programme launch, according to its own data, the GHF has reached only 13% of Gaza's population with food aid, a catastrophic failure by any standard. This isn't a solution, it's an atrocity in action. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was without a chief executive since its last one. Former US Marine Jake Wood resigned just days before it began operating in Gaza, citing fears for the independence and the neutrality of the organisation in the face of Israeli interests. The GHF has now appointed a new CEO, evangelical Christian leader and Donald Trump advisor Johnny Moore. This was him on a podcast last year.
I mean, I literally, 3 weeks ago, I told a friend of mine how much I wanted to visit Gaza. I literally told someone 3 weeks ago, I really want to go to Gaza. I don't know if I would be safe in Gaza, but I really want to go to Gaza. I mean, there will be an opportunity for when this terrible moment is finished, to envision a future where, Gaza should have been Dubai.
In reaction to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation shutting down following days of violence by Israeli troops against starving Palestinians, Moore has posted this. The US-Israel Gaza aid plan is working, so Hamas is spreading lies about it. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is able to operate in Gaza only on condition of serving Israel's interests. However, providing aid to Gaza while not under Israeli supervision is a dangerous business. The Freedom Flotilla's maiden Madeleine ship is currently sailing across the Mediterranean Sea towards Gaza in order to break the blockade. Those on board include climate activist Greta Thunberg and French-Palestinian MEP Rima Hassan. Last night, however, the ship put out this message.
Hello everyone, we are reporting here from the Madeleine. We are right now at 80 kilometers from Greek lands and 68 kilometers from Greek territorial waters. What happened is that we just spotted a drone. And we confirmed it is a drone, but we just lost visual with it. We could have either turned back or turned off the lights. We have our safety procedures here, and it demands us to go get all of our life jackets. We prepare to alert level at the maximum, especially if it's approaching us, and we sound the alarm for you. Now we count on all of you to share what's going on here, and to please let the world know that we are 80 kilometers from Greece, and we need your help.
Now, on this occasion, the drone turned out to be harmless, with the flotilla posting this shortly afterwards. Thank you to everyone who shared our live update and supported those on the Madeleine. At 11:12 p.m. CEST +1, 68 kilometers away from the Greek territorial waters, a drone began to hover above the Madeleine. The drone is no longer there. Thankfully, everyone on the Madeleine is safe. Team on land have bird back from search and rescue and have reported that it was a Hellenic Coast Guard Heron surveillance drone. We will update everyone as soon as possible. Please stay alert and stay with us. The crew of the flotilla, though, have every right to be nervous. The Israeli military has now threatened to raid the ship if it enters Gaza's waters. Israeli military spokesperson Effie Defrin said this in response to a journalist's question about how the military plan to handle the flotilla and its participants. We, the IDF, are prepared to defend the citizens of the State of Israel in the forward defence areas across all sectors, north, south, centre, and also in the maritime arena. We operate day and night to protect the maritime space and the borders of the State of Israel at sea. In this case as well, we are prepared. I will not disclose our deployment methods. We have already gained experience in recent years, and we will act accordingly. That recent experience may be a reference to Israel's storming of what was a 2010 flotilla that was also trying to break a blockade in Gaza. 10 passengers were killed and 30 wounded. Last month, a different flotilla ship, the Conscience, was bombed by a drone while in international waters off the coast of Malta. A blaze broke out in the bow of the ship, and the vessel began letting in water as crew members made emergency calls to the Maltese authorities. The fire was extinguished 2 hours later with all the crew reported safe by the Maltese government. Nobody has claimed responsibility for the attacks, though the flotilla has blamed Israel. One function of the flotilla arriving at Gaza is that it will be one of the very few times independent observers will be present in the Strip since Israel began its onslaught. For 19 months of the continuous Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, no international journalists have been permitted to enter the enclave, and humanitarian access is severely restricted. So there are few independent accounts of the situation in the territory. That's meant that increasingly the world is relying on the testimony of volunteer doctors at Gaza's hospitals to give an accurate account of the impact of Israel's genocide on the Palestinians in the Strip. One of those doctors is trauma surgeon Feroze Sidwha, who we interviewed on the show last November after he'd spent a period at the European hospital in Khan Yunis. Early today, Feroze joined me again, this time after having returned from a second period in Gaza at the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. I began by asking him about the state of Gaza's remaining healthcare infrastructure the second time around.
It's a mixed bag, actually. The only thing that was better is that the hospitals were no longer displaced persons camps, because the hospital administrators and the Ministry of Health had decided that, after the Israelis rolled through each hospital and forcibly displaced everybody from them, they decided that they wouldn't allow Palestinians to come back and camp within the hospital itself. Because when we were at European hospital, and the same thing happened at every hospital in Gaza, but when we were at European hospital, the fact that it was a DP camp just made it impossible to do anything. You couldn't, a hospital can't function with 1,500 people living in its corridors, like not patients, just regular random people living in the corridors, because they figured it was safer and there was some electricity and things like that. But it made it impossible for the hospital to actually work properly. So Nasser didn't have that problem anymore, which was good. That made it actually easier for us to work. But other than that, everything else was worse. The Israelis reimposed a total blockade on Gaza on March 2nd. And I got there on March 6th. The state of the population, Gaza has been hungry since about 2014, you could say, but it's really been starving since October of 2023. And that's had a major effect. It's, you're talking about but when I was there, I guess 16, 17, 18 months of constant deprivation, not just of food, but of clean water, of shelter, of the things that are much more basic to human health than healthcare is. And so the patients that we treated were actually much worse off than when I was at European. When I was at European, the Rafah border was still open. The town of Rafah hadn't been destroyed, and so people were still relatively well nourished. Most of my patients still they lived in Khan Yunis, and they still lived in a home. But now that's not the case anymore, and it's things are much worse. Or things were much worse even when I was there in March and April. Now they're approaching catastrophe.
When it comes to the blockade, how has that specifically affected medical supplies, for example, that you've needed access to?
For me specifically, I'm a trauma surgeon, which it's a little bit different than in the UK. In the US, a trauma surgeon is a general surgeon whose job is to stop people from bleeding to death. Not an orthopedic surgeon like in the UK. But so for me, my job is surgically speaking, my job is very simple. I don't need fancy equipment because there's just no time to use it. So with a scalpel and with basically any kind of suture, I can do almost everything I need to. So I was able to stop people from bleeding to death just fine. But basically everything else was impossible. Because that like not dying of blood loss is like the basics, right? Like that's not some sort of grand achievement in the scope of healthcare. You need to be able to put people back together. You need to be able to reconstruct them. Like we're not talking about people who got in a car accident and broke their arm. You know what I mean? Like we're talking about people who've been in explosions. They have traumatic brain injuries. They have cervical spine and other spine injuries. They have rib fractures. They have torn organs in their abdomen. Like all of these things need to be dealt with properly, reconstructed properly. That requires keeping the person alive through this event, which usually requires an ICU. And since the destruction of Shifa Hospital, there hasn't really been a functional ICU in the Gaza Strip. I mean, technically, like the building is there, but it's Shifa was the only place where critical care could really be done competently. And then there's just a million different things that are missing, making it impossible to do these things. And on top of that, we're not, half of what we're dealing with is badly injured children, and they require more specialized equipment, more specialized care, different types of specialists. All of these things are available in the largest hospital in the third world. In any third world country, these things are available in the big flagship hospital, but but not in Gaza because of the blockade. So like Mark Perlmutter, for example, he's a hand surgeon that was there with me. He ran out of, orthopedic surgeons. Like if you're trying to reconstruct the bones and joints in somebody's hand or their elbow or whatever, you're going to use pins and screws and things like that. It's almost like woodworking. But he didn't actually have any of that stuff. So he was having to improvise. Like at one point, he actually used the drill bits themselves, not proper hardware, but he actually used the drill bits themselves to pin two parts of a kid's elbow together so that it might heal. It's completely ridiculous. You'd lose your license for doing something like that in the United States, but there it was the only option. So these are that's the situation now. So when I was there from March 6th to March 18th, it was the blockade was on, but the ceasefire was still in effect, if you can call it that. Obviously the Israelis never really stopped firing, but at least the widespread massive bombardment wasn't happening. And so my work as a trauma surgeon there, for the most part, it was just like every day was a busy day in California where I normally work. But on March 18th, when the bombing resumed, that was the biggest mass casualty event I've ever seen. Nasser Medical Complex, really it has 250 beds, but there's a 200-bed tent extension. It's just literally a tent with a cot in it. There's no electricity, there's no oxygen. It's pretty useless, but nevertheless, it is a place for someone to stay. So let's just say it's a 450-bed hospital. Just Nasser Medical Complex alone, at just the morning of March 18th, saw 221 trauma patients, half of whom were badly injured children. That's completely ridiculous. There's never. I actually think I'm actually looking into this right now. I think it might have been the most extreme mass casualty event that's ever happened, on the planet. It was completely insane, and the mismatch of need to resources available, not just in terms of material like suture and anesthetics and stuff like that, but like trained people who actually know what to do. Let me give you maybe like a comparative example. So I was a resident during the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. I was still training at that time, and I was training at Boston Medical Center. And if you look at all of Boston's level 1 trauma centers, these are like the big flagship hospitals. There's 6 of them. And if you were to combine them, they have about 4,000 beds. On that, and they also, I think they have about 400 operating rooms. I think they have about 400 surgeons on staff who are capable of performing trauma care, things like that, right? Massive resources. That whole system together saw 129 patients on Marathon bombing day. And we all thought it was like the massive event, the life-changing, world-altering event. Nasser alone saw 221 patients. You know what I mean? Like it's just completely. I don't know of a time that any one hospital has ever seen its entire bed volume of trauma patients in one morning, and then gone on to basically keep doing that every day forever. Like they're still doing it now. In fact, Nasser is where most of the patients that were just shot in the Witkoff massacre went, and so it's just completely the system. No health system could possibly deal with this type of influx of patients, but certainly not one that is besieged and starved of supplies, of personnel, of electricity, everything.
I'd like to ask you about how Gaza's Palestinian medical workers are coping. We've recently covered the horrific story of Dr. Ala al-Najjar. 9 of her 10 children were killed in an Israeli airstrike in Khan Yunis, and her husband, also a doctor, has since died of the injuries he sustained in those strikes. How do Gaza's doctors, nurses, and other healthcare workers keep going when the risk to their lives and their families' lives are so high and ever present?
People who have followed the war, maybe war is not the right term, but people who have followed whatever happens in Gaza in the last 19 months closely will remember that there's plenty of stories like this, actually. There's a lot of stories of physicians in working in an emergency room or in the operating room, wherever it might be, receiving their own family members as casualties and dead. And no, I mean, I'll tell you, I don't speak Arabic, so the only people I can really talk to speak English, and that, I'm a doctor. I was working in the hospital, so mostly I spent time with healthcare workers, talking to them, getting to know them, and I can tell you that with literally 100% of them expect to die, and they expect their children to die, they expect their families to die, in this slaughter, and it has an effect. And I mean, like, I gave a briefing at the UN Security Council the other day, and I said, some people have said I was exaggerating, but I wasn't exaggerating for effect at all. I was just describing something that I've seen frequently in Gaza. I said that actually the way I put it originally, but they asked me to change it. They said it was too harsh. The way I put it originally was Gaza's parents memorize their children's clothing and tell their friends about it as well, in case their children are decapitated and need to be identified later in the morgue. But that's literally true. It's not an exaggeration at all. That's one of the first things the doctors tell each other. And I know lay people do as well. It's not just the physicians, but when they come in, they literally say, "Salam alaikum, kifek, shu akbar." What is your kid wearing today? Like, literally, I'm not exaggerating about this at all. It's just shocking. I mean, what do I don't know what that exactly does to someone's mental health, but it's certainly not a positive impact on it. I'll tell you another story. Actually, there was it's not about the doctors specifically, but it hits doctors and kids. During ceasefire time, I probably met this guy on like March 15th, something like that. I met a cardiologist at European, at Nasser Hospital, and he lived in Rafah, so he lived near the Philadelphia corridor, which is there are a lot of Israeli gun towers there, and they fire into the city. So at one point, and this is during the ceasefire time, at one point, he has four small kids, but the youngest is like a 4.5-year-old girl. So if you think about it, her only memories are from this insanity that's been going on. And she, one of the gun towers started firing into their home, so the whole family dropped to the floor. But the little girl, the 4.5-year-old girl, just kept dancing in a circle, playing, just entertaining herself like she had been before. She's completely ignored it. And her mom and dad said, what are you doing? Come here, sweetheart. And she said, "No, don't worry, mommy. The bullets are all the way up there." It's like, that's how a kid thinks about traffic. They don't think about its impact on them. But like, most children are afraid of gunfire. This kid isn't. I mean, it's just that's there's the impact that this is going to have on the mental health of the people of Gaza is totally unpredictable. But if you wanted to turn a bunch of people into angry, sullen, hostile people who are nurturing a desire for revenge. I'm quoting Miran Benveniste, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. But if you want to do that, this is probably the best way to do it.
That was Feroze Sidwha speaking to me earlier today. If you want to hear more from him, we'll be publishing a longer version of that interview tomorrow. You've heard it many times in the mainstream media. Young men love Reform UK. It seems to have received wisdom in many journalistic circles that Nigel Farage and his TikTok antics, plus Reform UK's anti-woke marketing, have been winning over the hearts and minds of left-behind young men in this country. Nobody seems to have stopped to ask one really important question. Is it actually true? Now, polling for this has been relatively thin on the ground. Not that the mainstream media haven't tried to just ignore this lack of data. Take this article from business magazine City AM from February earlier this year. Why are so many young men turning to Reform? Young men are flocking to Reform because Nigel Farage is telling them what they want to hear, and they have a voice and that it matters, says Oliver Dean. In the article, they make a lot of good arguments as to why young people feel aggrieved with an economy that does not value their interests. Poor wages, sky-high house prices and rents, for example. Yet their evidence of young men voting for Reform UK is patchy at best. They cite general election survey data by YouGov that states that only 12% of 18 to 24 men voting for Reform UK in the last election. That's the same amount of young men that voted for the Green Party, and less than a third of those who voted for Labour. They did cite a very small poll by JL Partners that surveyed 201 16 to 17-year-olds that showed support amongst the youngest Gen Z men for reform was as high as 35%, however. This is, however, a small sample size. This represents just 30 Reform UK voters who are actually surveyed. Here's another article alleging a potential Reform UK youthquake, this time from SW Londoner. Support for Reform UK grows among young voters. Young people are now increasingly more open to supporting Reform UK, voting intention polls from More in Common show. The latest figures indicate that among 25 to 34-year-olds, support for reform peaked at 23%, whilst for 18 to 24-year-olds, support reached 16%. Now, as they said, they're citing data from More in Common there about young men supporting reform. The data cited from More in Common shows that on average, support for reform amongst men hovers around 20%. Nothing to scream from the rooftops about, but not inconsequential numbers either. But then the article itself concludes that it is in fact not young people who are Reform UK voting, who Reform UK is seeing most of their gains from. Despite an increase in young people voting for reform, support rarely goes beyond 20%. Support for the party remains strongest amongst older demographics, particularly between the ages of 65 and 74, where it reached 28% in April 2025. So, what other data do we have? In the crosstabs for every YouGov poll since they fermented a sustained lead in the polls, Reform UK have not polled higher than 11% amongst 18 to 24s, meaning that even if 0 young women had surveyed would vote Reform, that's a maximum of just 22% of young men voting for Reform, well below the level they poll out with older voters, which is where the bulk of their support comes from. Now, this is not to say they won't vote for reform. Young men are disenfranchised and need to have policy directed towards them to ensure they are not enticed by the easy answers and grand promises of Nigel Farage. Men are now less likely to go to university, have declining trade union membership, and are more likely to work in the private sector. All indicators that they are more likely to lean right. So if these trends continue, we may see more younger Gen Z men join the Reform UK fold. What of young women, however? Given all the media hype around the mythical propensity for young men to support Reform UK, there's been very little coverage of young people, and especially young women's propensity for voting for the Green Party. If we bring back the election results last year, 23% of 18 to 24 women voted for the Greens, far more than what even the most generous polls currently show for 18 to 24 men voting Reform. Yet, total radio silence of this fact in the mainstream media. And this level of support has only grown over time. The Greens reached their all-time highest polling average recently, driven by an increased number of younger Green voters. Curtis, now, of course, this is different to on the continent you see in countries like Germany, for example, where young men are increasingly voting very heavily for the far right and in actual elections rather than in polls. But what do you make of this data? What's unique about the UK, do you think, in this regard? Will there be a Reform UK youthquake amongst young men? And why do you think the media just completely ignores the surge in young people supporting the Green Party?
Well, before I talk about the Green Party, I want to touch upon reform. I think there are two things at play here. Number one, the mainstream media narrative is they like to sort of add the ideological bent to a particular political party. What do I mean by that? Well, you can have someone vote for reform and the media will say, oh, it looks like that Gen Z or a particular cohort of people are moving to the right because they voted for a right-wing party. But it's not as simple as that. There's more nuance. Again, as I said earlier, I've spoken to many reform people and it's very different to the way the mainstream media sort of represents these people. You can have a conversation with someone and yes, all right, when it comes to social and cultural issues, they're pretty reactionary. And then they might say something very, very left-wing. So it's not as simple as, well, actually, people don't think in terms of left or right. So it's not as simple as categorizing it as that. So I think what's happening is people are just responding to their material conditions. And actually, that's an opportunity for the left. It's not that, a cohort of young people are moving towards the right and they're the lost generation. In fact, the left can win these people over. You just need to sell a story. Now, of course, I understand when it comes to social and cultural issues, things that we should all defend, but the mainstream media makes it rather difficult to navigate that. But when it comes to class, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to material needs, it's where the left is at its strongest. And that's where we can build a coherent narrative to bring people over. But I mentioned there were two things. The second thing is that doesn't mean that there isn't a drift with young men. It's absolutely true that if you're a young Gen Z man, you're more likely to be a bit more right-wing than young women. That's even the case for all age groups, right? So we shouldn't ignore that. It's very, very important that we realize that. But if we look at, across Europe, even look at France, Le Pen, she was doing very well with younger people because the competition at that time was Macron. And what Keir Milburn said, he wrote for Novara last year, I think I agree with this analysis, it's not that necessarily people are moving to the right because they like it. You've had a complete collapse in the centre ground. And in the absence of a strong left-wing voice, people are just going to the right. And I think that's where a lot of the reform support comes from. People are sick and tired of the same old parties, and they feel as though reform are offering something different. And again, I think that transcends age. The left, once again, has to have a broad, sort of a strong left-wing narrative. Now, in terms of the Greens, why aren't the Greens sort of being talked about as much? I mean, that is just confounded across the entire media. The media do tend to ignore them, so that doesn't surprise me. The question is why. Some people might be thinking, oh, is it some sort of conspiracy to deplatform the Greens? I mean, it is with some people. I mean, there are people within legacy media who are like, I absolutely do not want to platform these ideas. In fact, again, it's another anecdote, but we've had multiple times where we've gone to like a Green Party conference and we've spoken to people from Sky and BBC, sort of lower level journalists, who say we absolutely should be covering this stuff more. And they talk to their bosses or they try and speak to someone higher up and the bosses aren't interested. Now, broadly, why is that? It's because the left, whether they are inside the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party, are not seen as serious political actors. That has been the case for a long, long time. So there's no intellectual curiosity from the mainstream media to look at left-wing politics or left-wing political parties, because again, they are not seen as serious. And in terms of Nigel Farage, uniquely, I think the media are obsessed with Farage. Now, it's quite funny and ironic that Farage tries and paints himself as anti-establishment, but he's been in politics for decades. You know, he's got big name recognition. And I think the BBC and the rest of the corporate media are so infatuated with him. Not necessarily that they like him, but they love talking about him. And that often covers up a lot of the important gains the Green Party makes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is obviously a systemic issue at play in when it comes to the fulcrum of the important policy, which is economic policy. There are sets of material interests that Reform UK are in line with and Greens are opposed to, which is why one narrative is far more popular than the other amongst those mainstream media outlets. I would agree with you there. Since it began its genocide in Gaza 19 months ago, Israel has relied on brazen propaganda, outright lies, and endless gaslighting to try and maintain the support of the publics in the West. Countless Israeli government spokespeople and state proxies have taken to the airways to beg us to ignore the evidence of our own eyes, treating us like we're idiots. But it just isn't working anymore. Piers Morgan, who supported Israel's so-called right to defend itself long after it stopped being fashionable, has recently decided the country has gone too far. Last night, member of the Israeli lobbying group UK Lawyers for Israel, Natasha Hausdorff, appeared on his show, where this happened.
I was told by the ambassador to UK it was a blood libel for me to suggest that Israel had killed children in this war.
No, I don't believe that was the case. I think it was to do with targeting children.
No.
And there is a difference.
Right.
Because we are hearing that Israel is targeting children, and that couldn't be further from the fact.
Last week, 9 out of 10 children in one home where 2 doctors reside were killed in an airstrike. What was that?
Remarkable.
Well, what was that?
That has been based only on the basis of hearsay.
You don't believe that story?
Information. I want these stories.
Wait a minute. You don't believe that those children were killed?
I have seen conflicting accounts, and I want that story to be properly investigated before the international media runs with it.
You think those 2 parents, one of whom I think operated on one of the children?
I have a question.
You think that those 2 doctors, the parents, they just made it up?
Why are
that
those
9 of their
children
10 children had been blown to pieces by an Israeli airstrike?
If this is true...
You don't believe it?
Well, why on earth was artificially generated imagery used to promote this story when it first happened?
I've got to say, Natasha, I think what you've just said about that family is despicable.
We've seen time
I'm sorry,
and time again.
It's despicable.
Blood libel?
Somebody, you talk about blood libel, like Dave said, you talk about blood libel, you talk about lies,
all I said
you talk about promoting propaganda, and here you sit here as a lawyer and you say that you do not believe those 9 children were killed.
I didn't say that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Do you believe it or not?
I said that there were conflicting accounts.
Do you believe it?
And it needs to be investigated.
Do you believe it?
I thought you would be the
parents said 9 of their 10 children were killed. Do you believe them or not? Or did those 2 doctors make it up?
They haven't said that directly as far as I have seen. I have seen second-hand accounts and hearsay. But it's important to ask, why are these civilians still there? Why is it that
Actually, it's important to ask whether you believe that family have lost 9 of their 10 children.
I want to know why the international community...
do you? You don't. And this goes to the point that I would say about Israel generally now in this war now.
Civilians?
Israel says they don't believe anything
coming out of Hamas.
Every
Indeed.
story that comes out about the deaths of civilians in Gaza,
because there is a
someone
track
will
record
pop
of
up
lies.
representing the Israeli government saying, it's propaganda, it's not true, I've heard it's not right, I've heard it didn't happen.
Yes, all of those tens of thousands of dead kids, it's all just Hamas propaganda, apparently, right? Ridiculous argument for her to make, right? And just try and say, like, okay, there's conflicting accounts, right? Well, they are 9 children of tens of thousands. Tens of thousands. We have records, we have names. Oh, but it was the Hamas-run health ministry, so you can't trust the list of names or the eyes and ears that we all have hearing and seeing the devastation in Gaza. And the fact that the question that she has, well, the IDF clearly doesn't target children, then we have already seen reports, we have seen x-rays, we have seen evidence of children with sniper shots to the head. It's indefensible. And the fact that she continues to try and defend it is just absolutely wild to me. Now, Natasha Hausdorff wasn't the only pro-Israel mouthpiece to have her ass handed to her last night. Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer appeared on Channel 4, where Christian guru Murthy gave him this once over.
You're not allowing the international media in. You do not give free passage to the United Nations. You've expelled UNRWA, the organisation which was dispensing aid, and you're saying that you'll investigate yourselves. It's no wonder people don't trust that.
So we're not interested in your trust. Our priority is getting our hostages home, Christian. That's what we care about. We're not sending journalists in. We want to get our hostages out. That's what we care about. Now, real journalists enter Gaza with the IDF. Hamas journalists never leave. And many of these so-called journalists who have been killed in Gaza.
An escort around Gaza.
Yeah. Many
Most
of these
real
so-called
journalists from outside Israel are not
Gaza
allowed into Gaza. Let us in.
Right. So we want to get our hostages. We want to get our hostages out. And rather than you in, Christian, that's our priority. Maybe your priority
don't want us to see what you're doing. That's the truth.
Okay, so the story's on every single screen across the world. So this nonsense, this canard of it's not getting stories not getting out.
But not checked by the international media, and it allows you to say what's coming out of Gaza is untrue. So you stop us going in, and you dismiss what's coming out, and so you can carry on saying whatever you want, and you won't allow any independent investigation or scrutiny.
Look, when it comes to journalists, we are a free country. We are a free society. We have the most open media of anywhere, hundreds of miles in any direction. But unfortunately, an independent journalist in media in Gaza gets killed, because if you put out anything hostile to Hamas, you get killed in Gaza. That's the reality.
It's the Israelis who have a record of killing journalists. Whether it's Shireen Abu Akleh or James Miller or others.
That's an appalling, many so-called journalists in Gaza are actually, unfortunately.
Just incredible scenes there where he tries to not only try and move the dial away from the reality that Israel targets journalists in Gaza. They put actual photos of the journalists that they wanted to kill up on the internet, essentially as a kill list, right? And try and say that somehow that it's Hamas that are to blame for journalists being killed. They won't let people in without an escort so they can maintain their own narrative. It's absolutely crazy to me that this stuff is just continually said and they just expect us to believe it. Things like, oh, well, all we care about is getting the hostages back. You turned down ceasefire deal after ceasefire deal after ceasefire deal that had a full return of all of the hostages as part of those arrangements. And we know that it's Israel that's turned those down because this has been something that Hamas have been offering since the start. It is Israel that's the blockage to returning the hostages, as we have seen, because they want to continue the conflict. And Netanyahu wants to continue the conflict to maintain his power in government. Curtis, what did you make of those interactions?
Really, really wild stuff. I recommend your viewership, if you haven't seen the full interview with David Mencer and Christian Guru Murthy, please watch it. It is mind-boggling. Look, if you indiscriminately bomb Gaza, you're going to kill your own hostages. That has happened. So whenever they say, oh, it's about the hostages, they do not care. Now, to talk about the first interview with Piers Morgan, by the way, very critical support for Piers. I mean, I don't usually give my praise to him, but it was enjoyable to watch. Israel claims that we have killed 30,000 terrorists, right? And then Piers said, okay, then how many children have you killed? And they said, well, we don't really know. And he made a very salient point. If you know how many, we don't know how many terrorists were killed. They say 30,000, but we can't really trust Israel these days on anything. They had a number essentially, but how many kids were killed, they won't say. Of course, they don't want to say. Either they don't know themselves because they don't care to know, or they know the number is so high they don't want to say it. And this is the thing, right? One of the big casualties of this genocide is also the media and reporting. They won't let journalists inside Gaza. So whenever they say, well, you question Israel, you say we're killing children, that's blood libel, which I think is a disgusting smear, by the way, saying that's blood libel. Well, many people are asking the very logical and simple question, let us in Gaza, let us verify it. Maybe if you think we're pushing Hamas propaganda, prove us wrong, let us do it. They won't do it. So essentially, they just want us to trust their word. And that is how it's always been and how it's always going to be. And this is their tactic, right? Israel and spokespeople for Israel, the IDF, they are putting out so much lies that it's very difficult to combat all of them. You're trying to combat one lie and then they throw another one at you because that's their tactic, right? Just to sort of, they want to flood the market with their own narrative. But it's not working. I mean, look at the polling of people in this country, even across Europe. No one supports Israel. So they can do what they like in terms of their propaganda. People are not buying it. But yeah, I mean, of course, David Menzer, this guy used to be the head of Labour Friends of Israel. And it all makes sense, doesn't it? The internal fights within the Labour Party, attacking those on the left, those who support Palestine, obviously attacking Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. David Menzer was one of those people. He went on TV and called James Schneider. He called him a self-hating Jew. It's disgusting. And now he's doing propaganda for Israel. So we're going to hear this all of the time. What I do quite like is that there is a slight shift in the narrative in the mainstream media. Even Piers Morgan don't quote me, but I think he's used the term genocide. And some people are really starting to hammer Israel on this. Now, why has this happened? Why is there a change here? I mean, is it because they've suddenly woken up and grown in consciousness, or is it because some people worried, like especially in the media or in Parliament, that they're worried that they may be held to account as well with their complicity? Who knows? But yeah, it's wild to see. But I don't know how anyone could think that David Menzer did a good job here, because anyone watching would have thought this is absolutely bananas.
Yeah, nothing really disgusts me more than the accusation of blood libel being used so frivolously being used to defend the actions of an incredibly powerful state committing war crimes that we can all see and we can all hear and that we all know about, right? Obviously, blood libel itself being a horrendous anti-Semitic trope that's been there for years and years, used to smear people for something that is completely beyond the pale. But weaponizing that specific accusation against people who want to have proper investigations, proper independent investigations and verification of claims made by the IDF, and to look into the reality of what is happening on the ground in Gaza, and saying that anyone who makes any aspersions against the actions of the IDF is engaging in blood libel is the worst kind of weaponization, and it only makes everyone more unsafe when it is used so frivolously. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Curtis.
Thank you so much. Again, it's been a real pleasure. And of course, my debut, Novara, sharing the platform with you is amazing. And hopefully this is a first of many.
Absolutely agree. Would love to have you back on Novara. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.